Well, I'm still getting shit from people who seem to think that race is actually important, and I would like to share with you the story of the Irish in the United States. So, when the Irish started coming over to the United States, one of the reasons why they were fleeing Ireland en masse is because there was a lot of starvation and poverty going on. One of the causes of this was the fact that their crops just weren't producing, and then also on top of that, they had English forces who had come in and taken over Ireland essentially and stolen a lot of land. And this isn't like a poo-poo on the English or the British or whatever. This is just historical fact of what was happening at the time. So you had the vast majority of the Irish in extreme poverty. A lot of them are starving, and millions of people died of starvation in Ireland. These were not people who had access to proper nutrients. Then on top of that, you also had like the potato famine. And the potato famine was devastating. It was so devastating. And one of the reasons why it was particularly devastating is because potatoes were what the poor ate. The potatoes are very, very easy to grow, you know, as long as you have the right soil and stuff. They grew great in Ireland, and it was the source of nutrients that the poor generally ate because, you know, they could grow them in their yard and stuff like that. But the deal with the potatoes is that if you get blight on your potatoes, it will take out the entire field. And so, like, the potato famine happened because all the potato plants got hit by blight, essentially. And so the poor did not have access to nutrients. They didn't have access to food. Furthermore, if you look at, like, the coloration of ginger hair, from my understanding of that, ginger hair, red hair, can be caused. I'm not saying this is all occasion, but, you know, like the really, really super ginger people, like, a lot of times that comes from inbreeding. And I'm not saying that the Irish are inferior or anything like that. I'm just saying that that's one of the causes of the red hair. And especially the Irish people, you know, I don't want to say anything bad about them, but I mean, come on, you gotta take that into account when you're talking about the Irish IQ. So when the Irish came over, they were a very, very depressed and slovenly people. In Ireland, it was very, very common to just have your barnyard animals running through your house and just shit everywhere and garbage everywhere. And when they came over to the United States, they continued those practices. They were very slovenly. They were unclean. They were garbage everywhere. They had their barnyard animals everywhere. And this was in the cities too. And so you had a lot of employers going, no Irish wanted, no Irish allowed. No Irish wanted for work or whatever. And they're very, very discriminatory against the Irish. Well, guess what happened to the population of Irish in the United States? Within 2 or 3 generations, they were becoming political leaders. They were becoming community leaders. Now, you look at how they were when they first came here and what they evolved into over just a couple generations. Think about the different factors. They had more opportunity. They had more access to proper nutrients. In the United States, like, there was definitely more access to a wider variety of foods. And you have to think about this too. I know I've talked about omega-3 fatty acids, but it is a factor. And just think, if the Irish come over here, they're generally on the East Coast. I think a lot of them ended up in Boston, if I remember correctly. But the deal is there would have been a lot of fish. Probably would have been fairly cheap to go down to the docks and buy some fish or something like that, or go fishing yourself, or whatever. The point is that they had more opportunity. They had more, in a big city, they would have had, especially in the United States, where there was a functioning economy at the time, you know, there's perfectly good reasons why the Irish, who had been so slovenly and depressed in Ireland and came over here, got out of their slump, got out of their depression, obviously worked themselves up, but it doesn't have to do with race. It has to do with the environmental effects on them. And it did take a few generations. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't the next generation who popped up and they were immediately community leaders. No, it took a few generations. It took a few generations for the nutrients to set in, for the epigenetic changes to pass down. Okay, the Irish, even if you found a full-blooded Irish here in the United States, they're not going to be genetically the same as the Irish over in Ireland. They're just not. Part of that has to do with the environment. Part of that might have to do with a little bit of interbreeding, but say you were to find a pure-blooded Irish person or mostly pure-blooded Irish person here, they would be significantly different than somebody over in Ireland. There's been like 100 years or so difference between the two groups of people. That's a long time. I don't think you guys understand how quickly genetics can change due to epigenetics. Now, I'm getting yelled at because I'm denying facts. I'm hiding facts. I'm saying that we shouldn't talk about facts about different races. That's so stupid. That is not what I'm doing. And I'm bringing up this Irish example specifically because the Irish who became such prominent political leaders, such prominent community leaders, you really think the same thing happened in Ireland where the environment wasn't different? Are you serious? You really think something like that is based on race? No, the Irish didn't succeed in the United States based on their race. It wasn't because they were white, okay? They were in a completely shitty situation. Nobody wanted to hire them. But as they got, used to the environment, as they changed, as their communities developed, and mind you, there was so much discrimination from the Irish, I'm sure that their communities probably stayed pretty well insulated, at least to begin, which tell me that there was a real change. Starvation has a real effect on people. If you have generation after generation that's starving, yeah, your brain's gonna get smaller. Of course it is. Your brain takes up so many calories. But think about this. You come into a situation where there's plenty of nutrients, you're not starving anymore at least, and you have at least some access to food. Well, your brain's gonna grow. Having proper nutrients is so important. Look, I'm not hiding facts. When you're starving, what happens is that your body starts to cannibalize itself. It starts to eat the muscles. It starts to eat the heart. It starts to eat your liver. It starts to eat your digestive system. Everything shrinks, including your brain. There's no reason why it wouldn't affect your brain. And you know what your body does? It says, oh shit, there's not enough nutrients in the area. So it changes your genetics. It changes how your genetics is read by your body, which then, because it's useful to know that you're in an environment that is not nutrient rich, which is not calorically rich, that gets passed down to your children. And so they're born with smaller brains. I'm sorry, it's an epigenetic, I think this is the way that it works, okay? If you look at epigenetics and how it works, this is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make. And this is all scientific. This is all factual. You can look up epigenetics for yourself. So yeah, intelligence is part genetic. Of course it is. But it also is part environmental. And I think that people underestimate the amount that environment has, the amount of influence environment has on our genetics. Look, the Irish who had been insulated communities, but had gotten more to nutrition, had come to a different place, probably met a lot of new people, you know, had to learn how to survive in the United States, in that culture, in that situation, and stuff. It changed them. It changed them genetically. Of course it did. When you have a population move from an area which is like a desert and doesn't have very many opportunities for caloric intake, and then you move them into an area, say, where there's a lot of food, where say there's just a shit ton of berries, a shit ton of animals to hunt, a shit ton of wild, you know, cereal grains growing all over the place. Of course those people are going to get smarter. They have more calories to get to their brain. This is important. Your brain, the average person's brain, uses about 25% of your caloric intake, okay? Now, when you don't have that extra energy to expend, then it changes you. It really does. And that gets passed down to your children. But guess what? If you get introduced to a new environment where you have no nutrients, that also changes your genetics, okay? Different groups of people have different tolerances. Some groups of Europeans, like I think the Scottish, have more resistance to something like sugar. I, on the other hand, my family is diabetic. There's several people in my family who are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. And so I have actually stopped eating sugar because, well, for the most part, I've had some cake because it was my mom's birthday, but on the daily basis, I don't eat sugar anymore because I thought to myself, looking at my ancestry and the facts of my family history, you know, I look back, I go, I don't want diabetes like my grandfather. I don't want to be pre-diabetic like my father. I don't want to have to take insulin or check my fingers every day. I don't want to do any of that. And so I'm just going to stay away from sugar because I know my body can't handle that. And, you know, that's not a race thing. It has nothing to do with race. The fact that my body can't handle sugar means that my specific ancestors were not didn't partake in eating sugar as much as maybe, you know, like the Scottish. I say the Scottish because this is an example that Gavin McInnes used, but, you know, he's talking about how, you know, his ancestors drank a lot of whiskey, and what does whiskey really have in it? Well, it's alcohol turns into sugar in the blood. And so what he was saying is that his particular ancestors drank a lot of whiskey. They're really, really used to sugar. My ancestors, not so much. My ancestors were farmers. They were in the field. They ate very fresh foods and stuff like that. I don't get the impression that they spent a lot of time drinking. I think they were more into the tobacco and stuff like that. But I have to personally worry about diabetes. Okay, I have to personally worry about that because I've got a family history of it. That doesn't translate to race. So what I'm saying is that there are so many different factors that play into why different groups of people are different. You can find people of the same race who are very genetically different. This is why I don't understand why it's important to talk about race. What good does it do when you say that black people are stupid or black people have a lower IQ? What good does that do? I don't think it does any good. Just what good you can make it do is okay. Talking about genetic variations is fine. To generalize that to an entire race, that's what I have a problem with this. And people are like, the whole concept of a race realist to me is pointless. Look, you can talk about genetic variations without, you know, going into the race category, okay? Like, the African Americans in the United States are not the same as the Africans in Africa. So this is you can't like take a population in a different part of the world and compare it to the same population. The environment has changed. They've interbred with a lot with, you know, white people and other races and stuff. The Africans that came over here weren't even from the same regions. You know, you had different Africans of different regions. The Africans don't all have the same skin tone. There are some very light-skinned Africans. There's some very dark-skinned Africans. And there's a lot of them that are in the middle. I don't get the point to race realism. I'm not trying to hide genetic facts. Obviously, I'm more than willing to talk about the Irish inbreeding, which did affect them genetically. Their hair, you know? But that's not to say that it has anything to do with their race. I think the Irish are a really, really good example of why race realism is a flawed, you know, concept to begin with. You know, the Irish in Ireland did not change the same way that the Irish in the United States did. The environment in the United States is incredibly different. The access to nutrients were incredibly different. Their access to job opportunities and specialization was incredibly different. Now, people have tried to tell me that I think that race is a social construction. Clearly, genetic variation is not a social construction. Clearly, when I say that the environment has an effect on people, I am actually talking about the environment having an effect on people's genetics. People are trying to say that I'm completely ignoring genetics, or saying that it's not important, or saying that they're trying to say that I'm hiding facts about race. But the thing is that I'm not hiding facts about race. I just think that if you try to generalize to an entire race, it's fucking stupid. And to be a realist when it comes to genetics means that you need to be able to understand that generation to generation, groups can change. If you have a group of people, and this is a problem in the Islamic world right now, they're experiencing a lot of inbreeding. This is changing them, and this is changing them rapidly, okay? And you gotta think to yourself, well, so here's the thing. We are a sexually dimorphic species, and I think it's a real shame that, you know, in Muslim ideology, women are not as educated or not educated at all, because it means that the women are going to be, in my opinion, based off of what I know of epigenetics, the women not using their brains is going to lead to their women becoming less intelligent. The reason why westernized women are so intelligent is because there's been a huge push to train and educate us. Look, there are so many more women who are in scientific fields than 100 years ago. And, you know, you gotta think that some of this had to do because their mothers were educated, and then they were educated, and now their daughters are becoming educated, and their daughters are probably a lot smarter than their grandmothers. Okay? And it all has to do with the fact that they were pushed to use their brains. They were pushed to become educated. They were pushed through high school. So, you know, the grandparent makes it through high school. The mother makes it through junior college. The daughter goes on to go get a bachelor's degree and then thinks to herself, maybe I should get a PhD. I think it's just foolish. I think it's foolish to differentiate people based on race. This is really at the core of it. And it makes me so angry because I think it's so retarded. Generations change. Generation to generation. Your epigenetics change based off of your behavior, based off of the environment that you are in. And to say otherwise is extremely foolish. And this is the major problem that I have with race realism, is that I don't think it takes into account epigenetics. I don't think it takes into account. It's trying to categorize people, and I fucking hate that. Why would you want to categorize people? No. When you categorize people, you limit them. You say, oh, you're part of this group. And you see this all the fucking time. And I don't mean to conflate racists with race realists, but I don't really see a difference. If you're gonna be focused on race, that to me means you're putting people in categories. And people say that race realism can't be taken too far because it's realism. No. Race realism, I'm sorry, is an ideology. It really is. And whatever I'm pushing is my own personal ideology, right? And I'm not gonna fucking try to hide that from you, that I'm slightly biased, because my experiences with people of other races have generally been very positive. The only negative experiences that I've had with people of other races were literally my best friends growing up. And up until that point, I had positive experiences with them. So maybe I'm a little biased in thinking that race doesn't matter, but in my experience, the individual matters, not the race. Look, also, you know, the other thing with the Irish in the United States, did all of them suddenly become, you know, political leaders? No. Just the smartest of the group, right? Not all Irish people became community and political leaders. I'm sure there's plenty of Irish people who were dumb as bricks for a very long time, okay? I'm sure. But the fact is that there were some of the Irish who were able to change themselves. They were extremely poor, and then because of their environment, they change. And to think that the environment doesn't have an effect on your genetics is stupid. It's stupid. It's retarded. Look, if you were to take, you know, the kids from the inner city, you put them in a better environment, a more healthy, stable environment, where they have plenty of proper nutrients, where you know, they're actually being educated in the right way, what do you think would happen? They would become more successful as human beings. And then, you know, their children would be have more aptitude towards education. If you could push, you know, the inner city's kids to actually care about high school and to make it through high school and graduate, even if it's really hard for them, their next generation, it'll be so much easier for them to get through high school. Because when you actively use your brain, it does change your genetics. If you're actively problem solving, certain things in your genetics should turn on and off. Certain things in your brain. And if you don't believe me on this whole epigenetic thing, I would suggest you look up some articles about epigenetics and the experiments that they've done on rats, because it's extremely compelling and extremely fascinating. And racial realism, I just feel, is stupid. I feel like it's pointless. I feel like it's foolish. You know, you have a perfect example of why race realism is retarded in the Irish. You have a perfect example with African Americans as well. Now, the African Americans, when they first came out of slavery, and I will say this over and over again, they had a positive society. They had their own towns, they had their own businesses, they were becoming educated, they opened up their own colleges, they, if you look at old pictures of, like, young black children, especially right after, like, slavery ended, and during the period of time when the black community was actually doing well for itself, you see pictures of the young children, and they're all in suits. And part of the reason why is because the black people wanted to get out of poverty. They wanted, and it was a source of pride to have your children look neat and clean, and they wanted their children to look like upstanding citizens. You look at what that group of people, it's the same goddamn group of people right now who are in the inner cities. They're in the inner cities, and they're stupid as fuck, and they're violent, and they're shooting each other, and they're not making it through high school and they have no fathers and all this crap. So how do you take the same race of people, the same group of people who were successful, they were becoming educated, they had stable family environments, and then they transform into gangbangers and violence and ghetto rats and hood rats and shit and just in low IQ people? That's not because of their race. And I'm sorry if you're so retarded that you think that. But the plight of the black people is not because of their race. It's partially genetic, obviously. If you lack a father, one of the things that happens is that you are in a more increased stressful environment. And stress can be passed down generation. Stressful tendencies. Stress does affect your brain in very, very real ways. And I have issues with anxiety, too. And so, and I gotta tell you, that is genetic. I get that from my mother and my father. I got a double dose of that, so that's pretty shitty. But when you experience a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, your hippocampus actually shrinks. And the hippocampus is really important for regulating emotion and emotional responses and stuff like that. So people who are not raised with a father tend to experience more stress based on the environment that they are in. And as I've said, your behaviors change your genetics. This is really, really an important part of this. And so you see some black people, and they're very, very successful. They have very, very stable families. Think Will Smith. Extremely intelligent, extremely, active in Hollywood, and extremely successful. His wife is extremely successful. They're wealthy. They're well educated. They're doing well for themselves. So, I mean, I don't understand why race realism is a thing, other than it's a remnant of past racism. And when I say past racism, I'm not trying to shit on anybody. If you believe in race realism, I'm not calling you specifically a racist. What I'm saying is that I think race realism is a remnant of those racial tendencies. When evolution first came up, this is why people think that there's differences between the races, by the way. When evolution was first coming into being, the English used it in very, very racist ways, okay? One example, and this is a historical fact, is that when the English came into Rwanda or Uganda? I don't remember. Hotel Rwanda. I think that it was Rwanda, where the Hutus and the Tutsis. So the reason why the genocide happened in Rwanda is because prior to the couple of generations before the genocide even happened, the English came in and they sat there and they measured the size of the brain, and they measured and they looked at the facial structures, and they assumed that some of the group was inferior based on skin color, facial feature. Essentially, the group that looked more white to the English were the ones that were given power. They were thought to be more intelligent. They were given special privileges. They garnered more wealth, and it also garnered the hatred of I believe it. I don't remember which was which, but it garnered the hatred of the other group of people. And this was completely. This is completely constructed. There was no real difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis before the English really showed up. They weren't massively fighting. They all lived in the same region. Even if there were genetic differences between the two, it didn't matter at the time. It only mattered after the English came in and they started saying, oh, this group is more intelligent, better because they have more Caucasian features. That's part of it. Because when evolution first came around, the idea was that the Africans were less evolved, which is fucking stupid. You evolve generation to generation. You cannot claim that the Africans are less evolved. But this I believe, from my understanding of history, is one of the origins of different races. The assumption, and one of the origins of racism, the assumption was that the Negroids were less evolved. Because to them, they looked more like apes. Now, that is so fucking stupid. It is very clearly obvious that one of the reasons why they have darker skin has to do with the intense heat in Africa, the intense sun in Africa, right? You're not going to get the dark skin tone unless you have a lot of sun. Okay, just because they're darker doesn't mean they're closer to gorillas or apes or chimpanzees or whatever. That's just dumb. Alright, the other thing is, like, for instance, black people tend to have wider noses. Why do you think this is? One reason is because of the heat in Africa. Okay, you got a lot of fucking heat in Africa. And if you have a bigger, wider nose, you can inhale air a lot faster, so you can cool your body faster, right? And then another thing is you have more surface area. There's more surface area for heat to evaporate from the nose. This is another reason why certain groups of Europeans actually have larger, more beaky type noses, is because it's for a different reason, but it's also for the release of heat. In more northern European areas where the Caucasians were evolving, it was a lot colder due to the Ice Age and stuff like that. And so they would wear, a lot of furs and stuff. And when they were moving around and, they had long hair and long, thick, hair like this and beards and whatnot. But if you were moving around a lot, you would start to get hot. So they developed larger noses in order to combat the heat. Now, the other benefit of having a larger nose and larger nostrils and a larger breathing pathway is if you're in the savannah and you're hunting down gazelle as your main source of food, well, of course you're going to want to, have more capacity to intake air. My nose is retardedly small. I have to breathe through my mouth when I'm running. I have to. I don't really have a choice, because when I breathe through my nose, and my ex tried repeatedly to get me to breathe through my nose, but when I breathe through my nose, I do not get enough air. My nostrils, my air pathways, too small. I'm not a good runner for that reason in particular. But just think, if you're from a tribe or a group that has to constantly be running after things, your body is going to respond to it. Your genetics are going to go, oh shit, we need more oxygen. And it's going to start to alter your genetics. But it's not because they're less involved. It's not because they're inferior. It's not because of their race. It's because of their environment. The racial differences you see are only genetic variation. And I think it's stupid to, differentiate between different races of people. Like, I had an Ethiopian friend for a while. Her family were immigrants from Ethiopia. She had this tiny-ass little nose, that looks more European, right? But she was from Ethiopia, okay? Pure-blooded Ethiopian. And she's got this tiny-ass little nose. Okay, obviously, whatever environment her particular ancestors in was not as hot, or whatever. Ethiopia, I think, is closer to the ocean, so perhaps ocean wind or something was a factor in making that area less hot or something. Now, I'm speculating on that, so don't quote me on that. Don't fucking strawman me on that. I don't know why you would, but the thing is that the racial differences were essentially determined by the English, from my understanding. You know, the whole idea of evolution gave way to the idea of racism. And from my perspective, the whole idea of race is, I think it's just stupid. It's just stupid. It does nothing but divide us. Like, and you see this, different groups of people become very tribalistic, and they race realism bothers me because of the focus on race. And this isn't about hurting feelings. This isn't about respecting some idiot's opinion. It's just that I know a lot about the history of how some of these ideas came to be. And the prevailing idea when Charles Darwin was alive was that Africans were less evolved, which is why white people thought they were superior to them. And I just don't know why you would make racial distinctions between people. In my opinion, race is just a detail about a person. Like, oh yeah, I'm black. Oh yeah, I'm white. Oh yeah, I happen to be Caucasian. The only time you can apply, like, genetic realism is when you're talking about health, or you're talking about a specific group of people that's been isolated from other influences, you know? But it just doesn't make sense to me. Because the way that epigenetics works, from my understanding, and from, the evidence that I've personally seen, i.e. the example of the Irish, the example of African Americans, one group of people became more successful, one group of people became less successful. And I'm saying that this has to do, in large part, having to do with the environment. And then the environment then having an impact on the genetics. So yeah, IQ is genetic. It's also environmental. It's this vicious cycle. It goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. A group of people can become more intelligent over time. A group of people can also become less intelligent over time. It has nothing to do with race. Race is a distinction between different looking people. Okay? There are Africans with extremely high IQs. There are Africans with extremely low IQs. There are white people with extremely high IQs. There are white people with extremely low IQs. There are Asians with extremely high IQs. There are also Asians with extremely low IQs. I know they exist, and people would like to pretend they don't. The other thing I want to say about the Asians is some idiot thinks that I'm actually an Asian supremacist. They're like, oh, you don't believe in race realism, and then you call yourself an Asian supremacist. So obviously a joke, it hurts. So obviously a joke, it hurts. So this is the level of criticisms I'm dealing with. Even when I talk about facts, about different groups of people. Like, for instance, I talked about the Irish. That is a specific group of people. Now, I can talk about the genetic changes that happen within that group of people, because that group of people was like because they were discriminated against, they were more cohesive, right? And so you can look at that group of people and how they changed over time, and you can you know that the change happened, right? And so you look at the Irish over across the country or across the ocean at the same time, they're different. They're not the same. They're not even the same genetically anymore. The food that they're intaking is different. The air they're breathing is different. There's so many differences that would make the Irish and the America genetically different due to epigenetics. So people say I'm not including facts, or I'm trying to hide facts about race. I'm not. I know exactly what the facts are about race. I understand, some of the arguments for race realism. I listened to a lot of, like, Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux was where I was really introduced to the concept of race realism, and I found his arguments very, very convincing. And for a while, I did kind of consider myself a race realist, but I've come to the conclusion, learning more about, like, the history of racism and stuff, and the English, and what the English did when they came into, the Rwandan area, and were, sorting people out based on how they looked and stuff, and, this was before we knew anything about the genome. This was before we knew anything about DNA. And these people decided that these people were distinct groups based off of their appearance. I don't buy it. I just don't buy the race thing. I don't buy it. Look, I can breed just fine with an Asian. I can breed just fine with an African. I can breed just fine with another white person. We're clearly the same species with just a lot of genetic variation. I think you can be realistic about that genetic variation, but to claim that it's tied to race is stupid, when clearly it's tied more to environment and the changes that the environment makes to your DNA. Before we knew anything about DNA and how epigenetics works, maybe race realism was a legitimate, sort of argument. But at this point, I just see it as a remnant of the racism that was implemented by the English because they had the wrong idea about evolution. I'm not even saying that racism had a evil origin. What I'm saying is that when evolution was thought of, the Negroid race was thought to be less evolved. They were thought because the evidence was that the human race evolved in Africa. And so if the human race evolved in Africa, that must mean that the Negroid race was closer to that ancestor. But environment in Africa has changed over time. It's changed vastly. The sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahara Desert, the giant desert there, guess what? That wasn't always there. That used to be all green. It used to be like farmland and shit, Like, it wasn't like that originally. It really wasn't. And so you got to think to yourself, oh, well, climate change has happened. I wonder if that had an effect on the genetics of the people living there. Of course it did. Look, the environment continuously changes. Okay, and people who claim that it's anthropogenic global warming or climate change, I think's pretty dumb, considering the fact that there's been way more drastic climate changes in the past than now, and humans were not around to cause the issues, okay? But that's a different subject. The point is that over time, climates have changed. I mean, you look back even into medieval Europe. They had what was called the Little Ice Age, and a lot of people starved. I'm sure it did not do anything good for the IQs of the people in that area. And, that had an effect on the English, on the Europeans, and not specifically the English, but I'm sure the English were affected too. But Europe as a whole was affected negatively by the Little Ice Age. Other factors, plague, okay? Plague wiped out like 90% of the population at one point. But here's the funny thing, right? When I talk about epigenetics, right? Some of the people who got the plague the first time around, they developed immunities. And guess what? Those immunities were passed down genetically to their children. And so when the plague came around the second time around, only a third of I think it was either half or a third of the people died. It was a way, way smaller number. Now, you might go, a third is a lot, a half is a lot. Okay, half half might be a lot. A third might be a lot. But is it a lot compared to 90%? But why was this? Why was this? It's because the group of people that survived, the group of people who happened to survive the plague, their bodies were like, oh shit, this is here. Oh shit, I have to do something about this pathogen. Oh, we survived that one. Oh, but man, if that ever happens again, we better fucking remember that. And so it gets passed down to the next generation, the immunity, the resistance to it. And so the next time it comes around, yeah, only 50% of the people die, which is amazing compared to the fact that 90% of the people died the first time. I might be wrong on my percentages, but it's something like that. It got impressively less deadly because of the genetics that were inherited by the next generations of people. Okay, it had an effect. I'm getting tired. I find this argument incredibly interesting considering the lack of actual argumentation that I'm getting from other people. And people are trying to suggest that I'm hiding facts or don't want people to talk about race. I don't want people to talk about race. I think race is stupid. Can you talk about specific groups of people? I'm cool with talking about nationalities. I'm cool about talking about different cultures. I'm cool about talking about ideologies. I'm cool in discriminating against different cultures, because some cultures, like the westernized cultures, are significantly better than, say, like a third world oppressive tyrannical culture that, you know, subjugates its women and will behead you if you look at somebody wrong. I'm sorry, that's not a very nice culture. That's not a culture that is superior. And this is the last point I want to make. Culture is not racial. Anybody who claims culture is racial, I think is a fucking retard. Look, there was a golden period in the Muslim world where they were making great advances in science and technology and stuff. The Arab people are not inherently stupid based on their race. What happened, though, was that there was a lot of war. The ideology of Islam changed after that time period. It became more violent, it became more radical, it became more extremist, it became more intended upon, you know, dominating. I'm sure a lot of the text changed as time went on. And what you get now, you get a lot of extremists who don't necessarily have high IQs, who are very prone to buy into the radicalization and all this stuff. And just think, if one group of people becomes radicalized, their children are going to be more prone to repeat that behavior. Why do you think it is that as you get older, you start to find that you are more like your parents than you were when you were younger? Part of it is the genetics that they pass down to you. Part of it is, of course, being around them and picking up on their characteristics and stuff. Another way to think about this is, like, think about twins. If you look at, like, twin studies, and you look at twins who were separated at birth, they tend to be very, very similar. So, obviously, genetics does play a part in your personality. You will find that with like, twins who are separated at birth, they're actually a lot more similar human beings than twins who grow up together. Because twins who grow up together, they want to be different, so they purposely try to make themselves different. And guess what? You can have identical twins who have different heights. Think about that. Think about that. Based on their environment, they can be different heights. I know a set of identical twins. They are different heights. One is at least 2 inches taller than the other one. They're both going to be extremely tall, but the phenotypical appearance of one girl happens to be that she's taller. This is why I'm so confused why people feel the need to differentiate between races and not just, like, specific groups of people. Look, you cannot take information from sub-Saharan Africans who have a low IQ of like 70 and translate that into being genetically similar to Africans of maybe from the same racial background, but who live in inner city Detroit. You just can't do it. The inner city Detroit African Americans have been away from Africa for far too long. If you're away from a country or a place for more than a couple generations, you have changed genetically. It's generational. It really is. I really do believe this. I think you can find a lot of examples and a lot of evidence throughout history. Think of the Romans. Now the Romans lasted for quite a long period of time. When they first started off, they were a small group, starting in Rome. They were the Romans. They slowly conquered, and what they would do when they would conquer is build roads and assimilate the people into their culture. And when they had a very, very strong Roman culture that was overarching, things went splendidly for them. The people were, I would say, probably more educated than maybe in other areas that were not like Roman held. They had more opportunity for trade. They had more opportunity because of the roads that the Romans built. The Romans gave different groups of people so much more opportunity, so much more access to nutrients and foods and stuff like that. So there was a period in time with the Roman Empire where things were exploding, where it was just nation after nation that was being conquered and assimilated into their culture as they built roads and trade routes. And people, the reason why people did not rebel against the Romans as much as maybe they would have is because the Romans came in, they built roads and aqueduct and all of this infrastructure. You want to know why Western civilization has so much infrastructure? It's because of the tradition of the Romans. And, you know, the Romans probably went around raping everyone and leaving their seed everywhere too. So we're probably all white people are probably just a little Roman. Now, the Romans and the Roman Empire, as it progressed, got to this point where they started allowing multiculturalism, right? And multiculturalism, because Rome had gotten too big, it expanded itself, it overreached itself. And then you started getting a lot of corruption. And you started getting stuff like bread and circuses. The whole concept of bread and circuses is that you give the people welfare, so in other words, bread, and you give them entertainment. They won't be paying attention to what you do that's corrupt. And so the Roman army went from being very, 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 very well equipped with amazing technological advances in their armor, and they had amazing military formations and stuff like that. But guess what? The Roman Empire fell. And the reason it fell was because they had let things lapse. And things had changed. And the people had become dumber. Because instead of being active participants in politics and the community and stuff like that, they went to the Colosseum and they watched the gladiators die. And that was all they cared about. You know, like, you're going to dumb down your society if all they are able to do, because they're relying on welfare, and maybe I think part of it was that, you know, the economy had become too big or unstable or something like that as well. And there was a lot of factors to the downfall of Rome, and none of it is racial. So if you look at the Roman Empire and why it fell, and you can conclude this group of people became stupider not based on genetics, but rather based on environment and the corruption in the government and the whole concept of like bread and circuses. Oh, just feed them and entertain them, and you can placate the masses and stuff like that. It was foolish. It led to an unstable society that collapsed upon itself, and the Roman Empire ruined itself. So, yeah. None of that's racial. None of it. Absolutely none of it. Great civilizations have risen and fallen in Egypt, or not Egypt, but Africa, all over Africa. You can find giant megalithic type structures all over Africa. That tells me that there was some type of significant great civilization down in Africa. There's I believe, I don't remember specifically, but this was from like middle school or high school, so it was like a long time that I learned about this. But there was at least tales of a city in Africa that was extremely wealthy, had a lot of gold, and it was something that astonished like the Europeans who initially went down and found this place. And so, of course, you know, different races of people have built ginormous empires. You know, you can't say that, you know, when you look at the rise and fall of civilizations and you come to the realization that there were giant, complex, far-reaching civilizations within each race, I just don't understand how you can then go, you know, there's differences between the races. Like, no, every race had the same capacity. I think my real problem, one of my problems with race realism too, is that when you categorize people, you know, and label them and stuff, in my opinion, it feeds on, you know, I'm trying to think of the words to explain my thoughts. I lost the thought. I'm sorry. It's just, it's not based on race. The intelligence, racial, or, you know, genetic variations, you know. Can you even, like, what is a Negroid, right? What makes up a Negroid? Are Ethiopians Negroid? Are Nubians, or, you know, whatever the classical, whoever the Nubians would be like nowadays, whatever that land south of Egypt is. I don't have a world map in front of me, sorry for not knowing my geography. But, are they Negroid? Are the Moroccans Negroid? Are the South Africans Negroid? Which groups of people, specifically within Africa, are Negroid? And here's the other thing. What are the Arabs? Are the Arabs Caucasian? We don't consider them white. But from my understanding, the Asians are Caucasoid. So, they're the same race as the Europeans, right? And then you look at, like, the Asians. No, the Asiatic race. And from my understanding, the natives in North and South America are also Asiatic. So, but we consider them different races. What is the point to this? Okay, where do you make the differentiation? Why do you make the differentiation? Why is this important? I don't think it's important at all. Look, if you have Native Americans, the Native Americans in Pacific Northwest, they're going to be different than the Cheyennes, which are a plain Indian. Okay, they have different lifestyles. They have different responsibilities. They have different needs to survive, you know? Hunting buffalo on the plain is incredibly different from fishing for salmon in the rivers. That's incredibly different. It takes completely different sets of skills and different problem-solving techniques and different, you know, physical abilities and stuff like that. You know, lots of throwing ability to throw your spears and stuff. Lots of, whereas, you know, going fishing for salmon, and from my understanding what Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest would do, and I think they still do this, they take these nets, giant nets, and they put it like in the river when the salmon are coming upstream, and they just catch a whole shit ton of them. And that takes a different type of problem solving to come up with that idea and implement it. And obviously it would make your strong arms a lot stronger, but you might not necessarily be great at throwing a spear. Whereas the Cheyenne, Cheyenne warrior throws a spear year after year after year, practices, and then has a son. The son is probably going to be more prone to be, more accurate and stronger with the spear because his father practiced it time after time after time. I just don't see race realism as useful. The changes between different groups of people, it's subtle, like you go from England to Germany, and there's obviously, clearly, genetic differences between the Germans and the English, but they don't look as different as, say, an English person and an Arab. But theoretically, the Arabs are Caucasoid. So where do you draw the line? Where is the racial line that you draw? Where is it? Which Africans are Negroid? Which Africans are Caucasian? Because there are Arabs in Africa. Being in a spot does not make you a particular type of genetic race, if you want to talk about race. And when does, specifically in the populations of people, do you go from Caucasoids in the Middle East to Asiatic people further on? Where does that transition happen? What community? Which group of people? This is another issue, is that when you try to define people by race, it doesn't give enough nuance to the fact that each particular group and each particular region and each particular town can be genetically different from another group. It's just not useful. It's just dumb. I feel like it's just a leftover remnant of when we were trying to understand evolution. I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's useful to focus on race. I just don't find it useful. So I hope this video was informative. I hope that the facts that I shared are more interesting. And I really look at the story of the Irish as being a very hopeful tale, because what it proves is that a group of people can change within a few generations. They can become more intelligent. They can become less depressed. They can become more motivated, more hardworking. I mean, and you can't generalize that to all Irish. You can only generalize that to the specific group of Irish in the United States. Guess what? The Irish are still the same race as the Irish in Ireland, but they're genetically different. So when do they become another race? When does the genetic differences, genetic variation matter so much that you have to classify them as a different race? This isn't about protecting feelings. Look, right now, we live in a world that is obsessed with race. We live in a world where people are claiming victimhood based on their race. They're trying to get, reparations out of the government because racism and oppression and white supremacy and all this shit. It's pointless. You're so focused on race instead of improving yourself. If you improve yourself, you improve your children. This has been fundamental, I believe, in where I am now. This is the last thought I'm going to leave you with. My great-greats grandfather, or whatever, came to America, probably to seek opportunity in a better life. My great-grandfather wanted a better life for his children. My grandfather worked extremely, extremely hard to make life better for his children. This has been a very, very, very big sort of cultural thing in the United States. The idea that you want to make things better for the next generation. I feel like this is a very cultural thing in the United States. My grandfather worked extremely hard. He worked in his own, like, I think he owned a auto body shop with another person or something, and he would work on doing really hard labor. And he also worked at the mill, which was also extremely hard labor. And he initially was in the Army Air Corps, which was a lot of hard work and labor, I'm sure. And he was a mechanic working on airplanes. And that sort of impression got passed down to, like, my father. And my father saw that and how hard, my grandfather worked to make life better for his children. And I'm sure some of that motivation, some of that determination, some of that intelligence, that all got passed down genetically. But the thing is that if my grandfather was not striving for that, there wouldn't have been anything to pass down. And so you can improve upon yourself. And I think, this whole focus on race and shit, it makes people focus on the wrong things. You should be focusing on improving yourself, improving your situation, improving for the next generation. And if you don't focus on that and you focus instead on race, where does that get you? Where does that get you if you just focus on the genetic variation, on the differences between different groups of people? Where does that get you? Look, if you want to control population coming into, say, the United States, which we already do, what you would do is be like, okay, well, let's have a test or something to see how intelligent you are, to see if you can assimilate into our culture and stuff like that. But it really doesn't really have to do anything with race. You can create assessments that have nothing to do with race to determine who should and shouldn't be in your culture, your country, who is a good candidate to assimilate, who has something to offer. But it doesn't have to be racial. It shouldn't be racial, It's dumb to say. It's pointless to think about. I'm not trying to hide facts about genetic differences between different people. I just think that focusing on those facts isn't going to get to where you think it's going to get you. If there's a real reason behind race realism that goes beyond genetic variation, tell me about it, but I have not heard a good argument on this. And, even when I was listening to, Stefan Molyneux, the context was always in terms of, immigration and who we should and shouldn't let into the country, and how letting in people with low IQs has a negative impact on society and on the culture and stuff like that, and I completely agree with that. But my thing is, you can't say that IQ is dependent on race. You can't say that behavior is dependent on race. It's clearly not. It is clearly not. And so when you look at things like IQ, yeah, it's genetic, but it's not racial. When you look at things like behavior, some of it's genetic, but it's not racial. When you look at culture, that is definitely not fucking racial. So tell me, why does race realism matter? What distinctions do you make between the different groups of people? Where do you draw the lines? When does somebody stop being a Caucasoid and turn into an Asiatic person? When does somebody stop being Caucasoid and become Negroid? Where's the distinction drawn? Does it have to do with facial structure? Does it have to do with skin tone? Does it have to do with bone structure? And why is it important? How is it important? If you look at a specific country and you go, oh, the people in that country tend to have a lower IQ, that's one thing. When you say that an entire race of people, when I don't even know where the lines are in terms of races. Where are the lines? What is the line? How do you differentiate between the different races of people? When you have someone who clearly looks, Negroid, it's obvious. When you have someone who clearly looks white, it's obvious. But what about the people in between, where you're like, they could be white, they could be Asiatic, they kind of got darker skin, but their facial structure is a little bit more Caucasian. Where do you draw this line? What skin tone? What coloring? What facial features? What bone structure? What muscle structure? Where do you draw these lines? Because I don't know. Groups interbreed with each other. Groups mingle. This has been happening for generations and generations, millennia. Maybe not to a great extent in certain areas, which is why certain areas seem to be genetically dissimilar to other areas. We can still all interbreed. We're all the same species. Every single country, every single state has a different genetic makeup. Some areas of the South are more black. Some areas of the North are more white. The genetic variation within states in the United States is different. But what does that really tell you? If you look at the South and you go, oh, more people down there are black, does that really tell you about the population? And to what extent? Or do you think to yourself, black people in Alabama and black people in Louisiana are different? Of course they're different. Black people in Louisiana, especially in like the Baton Rouge, area and stuff, in the New Orleans area, they're going to have different culture. They're going to have different behaviors. They're going to have different genetics than a group of African Americans located in Alabama. They're going to be genetically different from the group of African Americans living in inner city Detroit. To me, it's just so obvious that race doesn't matter, that it literally hurts me to see other people being so retarded about it. I wanted to end this on a positive note, so I'm going to go back to, my father and my grandfather and wanting to make a better life. If you were poor, if you were stupid, so to speak, I'm not trying to diss on you. If you look at yourself and you go, yeah, I could be more smart, you can make yourself better, and in turn make your children better. But you have to actively try at it. You have to actively work out your brain. You have to actively problem solve. You have to actively improve upon yourself. One of the reasons why I'm losing weight is because I don't want my children to be overweight. I want my children to be healthy and happy. And my mom had a huge problem with weight when she was young. My grandmother was very paranoid about her being too skinny, so she would feed her milkshakes. Not a great thing for her necessarily, but my grandmother, because she came from poverty, she was really frightened of one of her children dying due to starvation. So she'd feed my mother milkshakes to supplement her diet because she was worried about my mother being underweight. My mother had serious, significant issues with being overweight for most of my life. And I've had problems with my weight since probably fourth or fifth grade. It's been a long time that I've had issues with weight. I'm technically obese, okay? And I don't want my children to be obese. So I'm actively working on improving myself. I'm actively working on losing weight and becoming more physically fit so that when I have children, the genetics that I pass down to them are positive, healthy genetics. And you know, genetics that, and I'm trying to work on my anxiety issues, and so hopefully I won't pass those down to my children as much. If I can learn to be more calm and chill and stress less and have less anxiety, it's going to have a positive impact on my children through epigenetics. So the point is, go forth. Make yourself a better person. And in turn, you're going to make the future generations better people as well.